The cabin sat alone under a sky so big it felt like it could swallow you whole. Up on Black Pine Ridge, the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the creak of old wood settling. This was where the girl lived with her grandfather. He was a quiet man, his face as lined as the bark on the trees around their home. He didn't say much, but he knew the language of the mountains. And he taught it to her Dot. Her name was Ilara. She was 10 years old, but life up here had given her an old soul. Her best friend, her only real friend, was Kodiak. He wasn't a dog. Not really. He was a wolf dog, a huge animal with a coat the color of a storm cloud and eyes like chips of amber. Her grandfather had found him years ago, a shivering pup lost in the rocks after something had taken his mother. They raised him on bottles and kindness, but they never tried to make him a pet. He was something else, a part of the place itself. Their bond was a quiet thing. It wasn't about tricks or fetch. It was about understanding. Ilara could walk into the woods and simply lift her chin. Kodiak would melt out of the shadows, his shoulder brushing against her leg. They had their own signals. A soft click of her tongue meant, "Come close." A flat palm held low meant, "Stay down." A certain look in his eyes, and she knew he'd heard a deer a mile off, or sensed a change in the weather. Her grandfather taught her these things. "He's not ours," the old man would say, staring into the fire while Kodiak slept at Ilara's feet. "We borrowed him from the wild. We respect him, and he respects us. That's the only deal that works." Ilara's world was the ridge. She knew where the wild strawberries grew in summer and where the icy spring bubbled up even in the deepest winter. She knew the path of the sun across the cabin floor and the sound of the old roof when it was about to rain. And she always knew where Kodiak was. Even when she couldn't see him, she could feel him. A presence. A guardian in the trees. That afternoon, the air was crisp and clean. Ilara was outside, splitting kindling with a small hatchet. It was a chore, but one she liked. The sharp thwack of the blade, the clean smell of fresh-cut pine. Kodiak was nearby, lying in a patch of sun, his ears twitching at every bird call and rustle in the forest. He was relaxed, but never fully asleep. She was stacking the wood when she felt it. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a feeling, a wrongness in the air. Kodiak's head came up. He was instantly on his feet, his body tense, his nose working the wind. A low sound, not quite a growl, hummed in his chest. Then she heard it. The crunch of boots on gravel, too heavy and clumsy to be her grandfather. 2 men stumbled into the clearing from the old logging road. They looked terrible. Their clothes were dirty and torn. Their eyes were wide, darting around like scared animals. One was taller, with a sharp, nervous face. The other was thicker, with a scowl that seemed permanently fixed in place. Ilara froze, the piece of wood still in her hands. The tall man saw her first. He stopped, his breath coming out in a puff of white in the cold air. "Hey, kid," he said, trying to make his voice sound friendly. It didn't work. It sounded scratchy and false. We're hikers." Got a bit turned around. The bigger one just stared at the cabin, at the truck, at Ilara. His eyes were hungry and mean. "We need food," he said, his voice flat. "And we need a place to get warm. Where's your mom and dad?" Ilara's heart was a frantic bird in her chest. She glanced quickly at the tree line. Kodiak was gone, vanished, but she knew he was there, watching. She could feel his focus like a physical touch. She remembered her grandfather's words. Asterisk, don't show fear. The wild things can smell it. Asterisk, they're in town, she said, her own voice small. Just me and my grandpa. He's down checking the south trap line. It was a lie. Her grandfather was in the root cellar around back, organizing jars of preserves. But these men didn't need to know that Dot the big man took a step forward. "We'll just come in and wait for him, then." He didn't ask. He told her. The tall man looked uneasy. "Maybe we should just—" "Shut it," the big one snapped. He walked right up to Ilara. He smelled of sweat and dirt and something sour, like old fear. He looked down at her, and his scowl deepened. "You got any money in there? Or a radio? A real one?" Ilara shook her head, her mouth too dry to speak. He didn't believe her. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard. "Let's take a look, huh?" A flash of white-hot pain shot up her arm. A yelp escaped her lips before she could stop it. It was a small sound, but in the quiet of the clearing, it was as loud as a gunshot. From the deep shadows between two spruce trees, a pair of amber eyes glowed. There was a sound. The lowest, deepest, most dangerous sound Ilara had ever heard. It wasn't a bark or a snarl. It was a rumbling promise of violence that seemed to vibrate the very ground. It was Kodiak's warning. The tall man jumped back, his face going white. What was that? The big man let go of Ilara's arm, his head snapping towards the trees. "Probably just a dog," he muttered, but his voice had lost its edge. He squinted into the gloom. Then Kodiak moved. He didn't charge. He didn't leap out. He just took one slow, deliberate step out of the shadows and into the slanted sunlight. His gray fur, thick and wild, seemed to ripple. He was enormous up close, his shoulders coming almost to Ilara's chest. He stood perfectly still, his head low, his gaze locked on the man who had touched her. The rumble in his chest never stopped. The big man took an involuntary step back. His bravado was gone, replaced by a primal understanding. This was no dog. This was something ancient and wild, and it was standing between him and the girl. Ilara's fear didn't disappear, but it changed. It became a cold, clear focus. She looked from the terrified men to her wolf, and back again. She wasn't alone in the clearing anymore. The balance of power, which had tipped so dangerously against her, had just settled back onto the ridge where it belonged. She slowly brought her hand down to her side, her fingers forming a familiar, silent command against her thigh. "Hold dot watch." And in the quiet, with the wind whispering through the pines, the standoff began. The world shrank to the space between the cabin door and the tree line. The big man's hand, which had been so tight on Ilara's arm, was now empty, hanging awkwardly at his side. His friend, the tall one, looked like he wanted to bolt, but his feet seemed rooted to the frozen ground. All they could see were those unblinking amber eyes and the impossible size of the animal standing guard. "Get back inside," the big man hissed at Ilara. But his voice was thin, a papery version of its former command. Ilara didn't move. She stayed right where she was, halfway between the wolf and the men. She knew that moving suddenly could break the terrible, tense silence in the wrong way. She kept her breathing even, like her grandfather had taught her when a bear was near. "Show calm, even if you don't feel it." "It's just a dog," the big man said again, more to himself than anyone else. "It's not," the tall one whispered, his voice cracking. "Look at it. That's a wolf. That's a wolf." The word hung in the air. It made the danger real, gave it a name. The big man licked his lips, his eyes darting from Kodiak to the cabin door. The cabin represented shelter, a place to hide. But the wolf stood directly in the path. "Maybe we should just go," the tall one pleaded, taking a tiny step backward toward the old road. "Go where?" The big man snapped. "We got nothing out there. We need that truck. We need what's in that house." His greed was fighting a war with his fear, and it was making him desperate. "You," he said, pointing a shaky finger at Ilara. "You call it off." Call your mud off right now. Elara looked at him. She felt a strange feeling then, not just fear, but a kind of cold understanding. These men weren't just lost. They were running from something. They were dangerous because they were cornered, and cornered animals do stupid things. She had to be smarter, Dot. She gave a very small, slow shake of her head. He doesn't listen like that, she said, and it was mostly true. Kodiak didn't obey commands. He understood agreements that the big man's frustration boiled over. He made a sudden, jerking move toward Elara, as if to grab her again and use her as a shield. Dot. It was the worst thing he could have done. Kodiak didn't roar. He didn't leap. He simply took 2 quick, fluid steps forward, closing the distance by half. The low rumble in his chest sharpened into a clear, teeth-bearing snarl. Every hair on his back stood straight up, making him look twice as big. It was a display so pure and fierce that the big man stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the gravel. Dot. The tall man let out a small, choked cry. Don't move. Don't anybody move. For a second, nobody breathed. Elara could hear her own heart pounding in her ears. She saw Kodiak's muscles, coiled tight like springs, ready to release. She knew that signal. It was his last warning. She acted on pure instinct. She lifted her hand, palm out, toward Kodiak. It wasn't the signal for stay or come. It was a gentle, calming motion she used when he was spooked by lightning. A motion that said, I am here, steady. The wolf's intense gaze flicked to her for less than a second. The snarl softened, but the tension in his body did not. He held his ground. Dot. The big man scrambled to his feet, brushing dirt off his pants, his face red with anger and shame. He was beaten, and he knew it. He couldn't get to the girl. He couldn't get to the cabin. The wild creature in front of him was a wall he couldn't climb. Fine, he spat, breathing hard. You win, kid. We just need some food, okay? Just some food and we'll go. Elara thought quickly. Her grandfather was still in the root cellar. If she could get these men inside, contained, maybe she could get to the cellar door, outside. But letting them in felt wrong. It would put a roof over their heads, make them feel in control again. No, she said, her voice firmer now. You wait here. She pointed to a spot on the ground near the woodpile, away from the cabin door and away from Kodiak's direct path. You sit there. I'll bring you something. The 2 men looked at each other. They looked at the wolf. They had no cards to play. Slowly shuffling, they moved to the woodpile and sat down on the cold ground, looking more like naughty schoolboys than dangerous criminals. Elara turned and walked to the cabin door. She moved slowly, deliberately, not wanting to trigger any sudden movements from any one man or wolf. As she pulled the heavy door open, she glanced back. Kodiak had shifted his position. He was now sitting on his haunches, a perfect statue of watchfulness, directly between the men and the door. He was guarding Dot inside. The cabin was dark and warm, smelling of wood smoke and dried herbs. Her mind was racing. She went to the pantry and grabbed a cloth sack. She threw in a loaf of hard bread, a chunk of cheese, and a few apples. It was a peace offering, but also a distraction. Her eyes scanned the room. The rifle was above the fireplace, but she would never reach it. The real hope was the root cellar. Its outside entrance was around the back corner of the cabin. If she could slip out the front, circle around, and get to her grandfather. She peeked out the window. The men were still sitting, huddled together, talking in low, urgent voices. Kodiak hadn't moved an inch. She had to be fast. Dot with the sack of food in one hand. She took a deep breath and stepped back outside. The cold air hit her face. She walked halfway to the men and placed the sack on the ground. There, she said. Dot. The tall man looked at it with longing. The big man just stared at her, his eyes narrowed and calculating. He was thinking again, and that was dangerous. "Thanks," the tall man mumbled, not moving. Alara gave a single sharp nod. Then she did the only thing she could think to do. She didn't go back inside. Instead, she walked calmly, her steps quiet on the pine needles, over to where Kodiak sat. She stopped right beside him, so close her leg almost touched his fur. She put her small hand on the thick, coarse fur of his neck. He was warm and solid as a tree trunk. She felt the vibration of his steady, quiet growl. She looked at the two men, her hand resting on the wolf, and she said nothing. The message was clearer than any words. Asterisk, he is with me. I am with him. This is our place. Asterisk, in that moment, she was no longer just a little girl they could scare. She was something else. She was a part of the mountain itself, and the mountain was telling them to leave. The silence that followed was heavy and full of meaning. The two men on the ground by the woodpile looked at the girl and the wolf, and for the first time, they seemed to truly understand their situation. They were not in charge here. The rules of the city, of quick grabs and loud threats, meant nothing on this mountain. Here, the rules were older and quieter, and they were being written by a child and a wild animal. The big man was the first to look away. He grabbed the sack of food, tore off a piece of bread, and shoved it in his mouth, chewing angrily. The tall one just stared at his own dirty hands, shaking his head slowly. Alara kept her hand on Kodiak's neck. The steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth under her palm, kept her own fear from taking over. She was making a stand, but she didn't know what to do next. She couldn't stand there forever. Her grandfather was still in the root cellar, unaware. She had to warn him or get help, but the men were between her and the old truck, and the only phone was on the wall inside the cabin. "We can't stay here?" the tall man whispered. His voice so low Alara almost didn't hear it. "We're not leaving empty-handed," the big one muttered back through a mouthful of bread. "Not after this. We need that vehicle." His eyes flicked toward the old pickup truck, parked on the side of the cabin. Alara's heart sank. The keys were hanging on a hook just inside the cabin door. If they decided to make a run for it, to rush past Kodiak for the truck, someone would get hurt. Maybe badly. The big man finished the bread and stood up slowly, brushing crumbs from his jacket. He didn't look at Alara or the wolf directly, but she could see his mind working, his eyes measuring the distance to the truck. "Listen," he said, trying to sound reasonable. His voice was still rough, but the edge of panic was back. "We're leaving, okay? We just need your truck. We'll leave it. Down the mountain. Someone will find it." Alara shook her head. No, it was a simple word, but it stopped him cold. His face flushed red again. "You don't get to say no. You see our situation? We are leaving. One way or another." He took a step, not toward the truck, but sideways, like he was trying to find a new angle. Kodiak's head turned to follow him, a movement as smooth and silent as oil. A fresh, warning growl started deep in the wolf's chest. The man froze. "Call him off," he shouted, his patience gone. Alara knew she was losing control of the standoff. The man's fear was turning back into desperation, and desperate people are unpredictable. She had to change the game. She had to give them a way out that felt like their idea. She took a slow breath, the cold air sharp in her lungs. "If you try to take the truck," she said, keeping her voice as flat as her grandfather's, "he will stop you." She didn't say how. She didn't need to. The image was clear in the cold air. But there's a ranger station at the bottom of the main trail. It's 5 miles. The tall man looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "A ranger station? It's just a trail," the big man sneered. "A trap. She's sending us into the woods so her pet can finish us. He's not my pet, Ilara said, and for the first time, a little heat came into her words. And I'm not sending you alone. I'll show you the way. Both men stared at her, confused. The big man's scowl deepened. What? You walk? I'll walk with you? He'll walk with us. She patted Kodiak's neck. You get to the Rangers. You tell them whatever you want. But you leave this place, now. The idea hung in the air between them. It was crazy. It was the only way. The tall man was already nodding, desperate for any plan that didn't end with those teeth. Yes, okay, we walk. We just walk to the Rangers. The big man was silent for a long time. He looked at the wolf. He looked at the stubborn set of the girl's jaw. He looked at the darkening sky. Winter days ended early on the ridge, and the shadows were already growing long and cold. The thought of being on this mountain, lost in the dark, with that thing possibly hunting them. It was worse than any jail cell. Finally, he spat on the ground. Fine, we walk. But no tricks. You walk in front, with him. Ilara nodded. This was the dangerous part. She had to get them moving, away from the cabin, away from her grandfather. Once they were on the trail, she would have the upper hand. She knew every route and turn. They knew nothing. Okay, she said. She gave Kodiak's fur a gentle tug, a signal she used when she wanted him to walk beside her. Let's go. She turned her back on the men, a move that took every ounce of courage she had. She began walking toward the narrow path that led off the ridge and down into the dense pine forest. Kodiak fell into step beside her, his shoulder brushing her leg. After a moment, she heard the clumsy, hesitant footsteps of the two men following, keeping a careful distance. They entered the woods, and the world changed. The open sky was gone, replaced by a ceiling of evergreen branches. The light was dim and green. The only sounds were their footsteps, the men's ragged breathing, and the occasional huff from Kodiak. Ilara didn't look back. She walked with her back straight, following the familiar path. She could feel Kodiak's total awareness, his ears swiveling to track the men behind them. He was her rear guard. She was his guide. For the men, the walk was a kind of quiet torture. Every snapped twig made them jump. Every time Kodiak paused to sniff the air, they froze. They were being marched to justice, not by armed officers, but by a little girl and a wolf. Their shame was a colder companion than the mountain air. Ilara's mind was racing ahead. 5 miles was a long walk. Could she keep control the whole time? What would the Rangers do? She pushed the questions away. One step at a time. Just get them down the mountain. Get them away from home. The trail began to slope downward more steeply. The cabin was far behind them now, swallowed by the trees. They were in the belly of the forest, and for the moment, the strange, quiet parade moved forward, the balance held by the simple, unbreakable bond between a child and the wild. The forest closed around them like a living tunnel. The only light was a pale grayish-green, filtering down through a tangle of fir and pine branches high above. The path was not much more than a worn groove in the pine needles and moss, but Ilara followed it without a second thought. She knew this trail the way she knew the lines on her own hands. Every dip, every bent branch, every rock that shut it out. Behind her, the two men stumbled and slipped. Their boots, meant for pavement, slid on the damp moss. They breathed loudly, their fear turning the simple hike into a struggle. Kodiak moved like a ghost beside her, his paws making no sound at all. His head was up, his ears constantly in motion, listening to the forest and to the men. He was the perfect warden, silent and alert. For a while, the only sounds were the crunch of footsteps, the men's heavy breathing, and the distant call of a jay. The tall man was clearly terrified, jumping at every little noise. The big man's anger had curdled into a sullen, simmering silence. Elara could feel his eyes on her back, and it made the skin between her shoulder blades itch. The trail dipped into a small, damp hollow where a stream trickled across the path. Elara hopped from stone to stone, her movements quick and sure. Kodiak splashed through the shallow, icy water without breaking stride. The big man stopped at the edge of the stream. "Hold up," he grunted. Elara paused on the other side, turning to look. Kodiak stopped too, half turning his massive head to watch the men. "This is stupid," the big man said, his voice echoing dully in the small space. He wiped his sweaty face on his sleeve. "We're just walking ourselves to jail." On the word of a kid. The tall man looked nervously from his friend to the wolf. "Just keep walking, man, please." "No," the big man said, a new dangerous idea lighting up his eyes. He looked at Elara, then at the dense woods to their left. "The station's that way, right?" he said, pointing vaguely south. Elara nodded slowly. "Then we don't need a guide anymore. We'll cut through. Get there on our own." He took a step off the path, into the thick underbrush of ferns and fallen logs. It was a foolish, desperate move. The woods here were a maze. Even experienced hunters could get turned around in 100 yards. But if they got lost and desperate, they might circle back toward the cabin. They might find her grandfather. Elara felt a spike of real panic. She couldn't let them leave the trail. Kodiak sensed the shift. As the big man pushed through a curtain of ferns, the wolf took 3 quick steps back across the stream. He didn't growl. He didn't snarl. He simply placed himself at the edge of the path, blocking the way into the deep woods. He stood there, immovable as a boulder, and looked at the man. The message was unmistakable. "You stay on the path." The big man stared at the animal, his chest heaving. The tall man put a hand on his arm. "Come on, don't. Just stay on the road, please." A silent battle played out on the man's face, rage, pride, and finally, the cold, sinking understanding that he was not in control of anything, not even his own direction. With a sound of disgust, he shoved his way back onto the trail, rushing past Kodiak as if he wasn't there, though he gave the wolf a very wide berth. "Fine," he muttered. "Keep walking." The tension after that was even thicker. The failed rebellion had left the big man humiliated and even more volatile. Elara knew she had to keep them focused, keep them moving. The afternoon was slipping away. The temperature was dropping. They climbed a steep, rocky section of the trail. The men were panting now, their breath puffing out in white clouds. Elara, used to the mountain, paced herself. At the top of the rise, the trees thinned slightly, offering a glimpse of the valley far below. The view was huge and empty. The tall man stopped, staring out, looking utterly defeated. "It's so far," he whispered, almost to himself. Elara stopped too, giving them a moment. She crouched down, more to be on Kodiak's level than anything else. She scratched behind his ear, the way he liked. He leaned into her hand slightly, but his eyes never left the men. In that simple touch, they communicated. She was thanking him. He was telling her he was still watching. The big man watched this, a strange expression on his face. It wasn't softness. It was more like confusion. The simple, quiet trust between the girl and the beast was something completely outside his understanding. He lived in a world of takers and threats. This was a world of give and take, of silent partnership. It unnerved him more than the teeth or the growls. Why doesn't it just attack? He asked suddenly, his voice rough. Elara stood up, her hand resting on Kodiak's head. "He doesn't want to," she said simply. "He just wants you to leave." "So do I. The truth of it, stated so plainly by a child, seemed to hit the man. He wasn't worth attacking. He was just a nuisance to be removed. His shoulders slumped a little. The fight seemed to drain out of him, leaving behind something tired and hollow. "Let's just get this over with," he said, and for the first time, he didn't sound angry. He just sounded done. They moved on, the pace a little quicker now. The men were no longer thinking of escape. They were just thinking of an end to this terrible walking dread. The trail began to widen, the trees spacing out. Alara knew they were getting closer to the valley floor, to the old logging road that led to the ranger station dot as they rounded a final bend. The forest opened up onto a 2-track dirt road, deeply rutted by tires. Alara stopped. She pointed down the road to where a simple brown wooden building with a metal roof was just visible in the distance, smoke curling from its chimney. "There," she said. The two men stared at the building. It looked like Salvation. It looked like an N.ELARI looked at them, then at Kodiak. Her job was almost done, but she had to see it through. She had to deliver them all the way to the door. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the road, the final stretch of their long, strange walk. The dirt road felt strange under Alara's feet after the soft, quiet path of the forest. It was hard and open. The sight of the ranger station in the distance made the whole journey feel suddenly real. This was actually happening. She was walking 2 criminals to justice. She glanced behind her. The 2 men looked worn out, their heads down, watching their own feet shuffle through the dust. All the fight had gone out of them. The walk through the woods, under the watchful eye of the wolf, had scraped away their anger and left only a deep, tired shame. Kodiak now walked at the rear of their little group, a quiet, gray shadow making sure no one tried to slip away into the trees that lined the road. He didn't need to growl anymore. His presence was enough. As they got closer to the station, Alara could see a porch with a wooden railing. A man in a green jacket stepped out, holding a metal mug. He was about to take a sip when he froze, his eyes widening at the strange parade coming up his road. He set the mug down slowly and stood up straight, his hand drifting to the radio on his belt. Alara's heart thumped hard. This was the moment. She hoped the ranger would understand, that he wouldn't do anything sudden that might scare Kodiak or make the men panic. They stopped about 20 feet from the porch. The ranger, an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes that were now full of confusion, looked from the 2 rough-looking men to the small, serious girl, and then to the large wolf dog behind them. His gaze lingered on Kodiak, recognizing the wild shape in him. "Afternoon," the ranger said carefully, his voice calm and steady. "Can I help you folks?" The 2 men said nothing. They just looked at the ground. It was as if they had used up all their words on the mountain. Alara took a small step forward. She had to make her voice work. "These men came to our cabin," she began, her words clear in the cold air. "Up on Black Pine Ridge, they were. They were trying to take things. And they grabbed me." The ranger's expression changed instantly. The kindness in his eyes hardened into sharp attention. He looked at the men with a new understanding. "I see," he said, his voice lower now. He kept his movements slow as he unclipped his radio. He spoke into it quietly, too low for Alara to hear, but she knew he was calling for help. He looked back at Alara. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" Alara shook her head. "No, sir." She gestured slightly with her hand, a small movement toward Kodiak. He didn't let them. The ranger's eyes flicked to the wolf, then back to her. A look of awe and disbelief passed over his face. He addressed the 2 men. "You 2 just stand right there. Don't move." There was no argument from them. They were done, and the ranger focused on Alara. "And your granddad? Is he okay?" "He's at the cabin. He was in the root cellar." He doesn't know. The ranger nodded, thinking fast. All right. We'll get someone up there right quick to check on him. He paused, looking at the scene again. You brought them all the way down here? Yes, sir. With him? He nodded toward Kodiak. Yes. For a long moment, the ranger was silent. He had seen a lot in these mountains, but he had never seen this. He shook his head, a faint, amazed smile touching his lips. Well, he said softly, I'll be. Soon, the quiet of the valley was broken by the sound of engines. A sheriff's department truck and another ranger vehicle came bumping up the dirt road, kicking up dust. 2 deputies stepped out, their hands resting on their belts. They took in the scene, the 2 dejected men, the ranger, the girl, and the wolf with stunned expressions. The ranger walked over and spoke to them in low tones. Alara saw the deputies' eyes go wide. They looked at her, then at Kodiak, who sat now on his haunches beside her, watching everything with calm, detached interest. The deputies approached the 2 men carefully. There was no struggle. The tall man just held out his wrists. The big man did the same, his face a blank mask. It was over. The law was here, and they gave themselves to it willingly, grateful for its ordinary, human rules dot as the deputies led the men to the truck to be driven away. The older ranger came back over to Ilara. He crouched down so he was closer to her height. You did an incredibly brave thing, he said, and a very smart thing. But you must have been scared. Ilara nodded. Now that it was over, a shaky feeling was starting in her knees. I was, but Kodiak wasn't. The ranger smiled properly this time. No, I don't expect he was. He looked at the wolf with deep respect. He's a good friend to have. He's family, Ilara corrected quietly. The ranger's smile softened. That he is. He stood up. Now we're going to give you a ride home in the warm truck. Get you back to your granddad. But your friend here? He looked at Kodiak. The truck might be a bit tight for him. Ilara understood. She turned to Kodiak. The wolf looked at her, his head tilted. The job was done. The threat was gone. She placed both her hands on the sides of his furry face and leaned her forehead against his. She stood like that for a moment, breathing in his familiar, wild smell of pine and cold earth. Then she stepped back. Go home, she whispered, making a gentle shooing motion back toward the woods. Go tell Grandpa I'm okay. Kodiak looked at her, then at the ranger, and back at the dark line of trees from which they had come. He understood. He gave a soft huff, a puff of air from his nose, and nudged her hand once with his head. Then he turned and trotted back to the edge of the forest. He paused, looking back once over his shoulder, a gray ghost against the green. Then he vanished into the shadows, silent as he had always been. The ride back up the mountain in the ranger's warm truck felt like a dream. The trees flashed by the window, but it all seemed blurry and far away. When they pulled into the clearing, Ilara saw her grandfather standing on the porch, his face pale with worry. He had been found by the other rangers and told a story he could hardly believe. Ilara pushed open the truck door and ran to him. He wrapped her in a hug so tight it took her breath away. Over his shoulder, she saw the ranger talking to him, pointing down the mountain, shaking his head in wonder. Later, by the fire, after the rangers had left and the cabin was quiet again, her grandfather listened as she told the whole story. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, just staring into the flames. You remembered everything I taught you, he said finally, his voice thick. You were calm. You used your head. And you trusted your friend. Just then, a soft whine came from outside the door. Ilara got up and opened it. Kodiak stood there, his coat dusted with new snow that was beginning to fall. He walked in, went straight to his usual spot by the hearth, circled 3 times, and lay down with a heavy sigh, as if it had been just another normal day. Elara sat down next to him, leaning against his warm side. Her grandfather poked the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind whispered across Black Pine Ridge, but inside the small cabin, all was safe and all was warm. The mountain had protected its own.